Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of 1974 Moscow. Imagine, if you will, a city draped in a heavy, suffocating blanket of gray. The Soviet capital in the mid-70s was a place of ironclad routine and quiet, dimly lit streets where the silence was only broken by the distant, rhythmic thrum of the railway. The winter of 1974 arrived with a particular cruelty, a biting frost that seemed to seep through the thickest wool coats and settle deep within the marrow of the bone. In these twilight hours, the grand architecture of the city, the massive stone facades and the towering monuments, loomed like giants in the mist, watching over a populace that moved in hurried, muffled steps. The air was thick with the scent of burning coal and the sharp, metallic tang of the industrial outskirts, where the boundary between the city and the wilderness began to blur. At the heart of this narrative is the railway, a sprawling network of steel veins that connected the vast reaches of the Soviet Union to its beating heart. In 1974, the stations were hubs of constant, weary motion. We find ourselves focusing on the late-night arrivals, the trains that pulled into the platforms long after the city had technically gone to sleep. There is a specific kind of loneliness found at a railway platform at midnight. The screech of iron against iron, the hissing of steam into the frozen air, and the flickering glow of yellowed lamps casting long, distorted shadows across the tracks. It was here, amidst the steam and the shadows, that the first ripples of a coming nightmare began to stir. The travelers who stepped off these trains were often tired, their eyes fixed on the ground, oblivious to the fact that someone might be watching them from the darkness beyond the station lights. Among the millions living in this state of controlled quiet was a young man named Vladimir Usov. Born into a home fractured by hardship and the heavy cloud of alcohol, Usov grew up in a world that felt increasingly distant from the one occupied by his peers. By the time he reached his teenage years, the voices had begun. They were whispers at first, quiet and persistent, telling him that he did not belong in the classrooms or the bright spaces of the city. He was a shadow moving through a world of light. By 1974, Usov was 17 years old, a young man who had already been touched by the hand of psychiatric evaluation and diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He lived on the margins, a ghost in the machine of the Soviet state, his mind a labyrinth of growing compulsions and dark, internal commands that would soon find a terrifying outlet in the physical world. The first disappearance occurred in the humid heat of August, 1974, but its legacy would be felt in the cold months that followed. A young boy named Boris, only 8 years old, had been playing in a courtyard, a place that should have been safe under the watchful eyes of the surrounding apartment blocks. A man in a simple sports suit approached him, offering the innocent lure of gathering nuts in a nearby forest. In the eyes of an 8-year-old, the stranger was just another adult, a face among many. Boris followed him away from the safety of the pavement and into the deepening green of the woods. He was never seen alive again. This was the moment the threshold was crossed. The search for the boy was frantic, but ultimately yielded only the most tragic of results. 2 kilometers from the village, in the thick undergrowth of a forest massif, the child's body was discovered. The discovery of the crime scene was a chilling introduction to the brutality that Vladimir Usov was capable of. The investigators who arrived found themselves standing in a silent grove, where the ground was already beginning to harden with the coming autumn chill. There were signs of a struggle, but more disturbingly, there were signs of a meticulous and senseless violence. The coroner's report spoke of strangulation and a level of aggression that seemed impossible for a lone assailant to inflict on such a small victim. Yet, in the Soviet Union of 1974, the concept of a serial predator was something the authorities were loath to acknowledge. Crimes of this nature were often suppressed or attributed to isolated incidents of madness. This silence from the state created a vacuum, a space where the killer could retreat into the shadows, emboldened by the lack of public alarm and the slow, grinding gears of the local militia. As the winter of 1974 deepened and the snow began to pile high against the railway embankments, the atmosphere in the outskirts of Moscow grew tense. People began to notice the way the light seemed to die out earlier each day, and how the gaps between the street lamps felt wider than they used to. The railway lines, once merely a symbol of travel and progress, began to feel like conduits for something far more sinister. Every midnight arrival brought with it the possibility of a shadow detaching itself from the crowd. Vladimir Usov had tasted the darkness, and the voices in his head were no longer whispers. They were demands. The first crime scene was but a prologue to a winter that would leave the city breathless with a fear it was not yet allowed to name. We pause here, at the edge of the tracks, as the first flakes of snow begin to fall over the evidence of a life stolen too soon. The winter of 1974 did not arrive with a whisper. It descended with a heavy blanket of white that swallowed the industrial skyline of Kybyshev. In the outskirts, where the concrete bled into the skeletal gray of the birch forests, the air was cold as glass. Here, amidst the drifting silence, the second shadow fell. While the August tragedy was treated as an anomaly, the December frost brought a chilling confirmation. As temperatures plummeted to 20 degrees below zero, a young boy named Valery vanished into the gray afternoon. He was last seen near the Tolyatti district, a small figure in a thick wool coat, disappearing toward the dark tree line where the meager light of the sun was already beginning to fail into the violet of the Russian dusk. When search parties broke through the heavy drifts the following morning, they found a story written in the frozen crust of the earth. The senior investigators began to call it the patterns in the snow. Two distinct sets of tracks were preserved in the ice, one small and hesitant, the other larger and disturbingly rhythmic. They led away from the housing blocks into a clearing where the wind could not reach. The scene was held in a macabre stillness. The boy, 7 years old, lay in a disturbed circle of white where the snow was churned into jagged peaks. To the officers in the biting wind, the violence of the struggle was etched into every furrow. It was a visual record of a predator's patience and a child's final moments, captured in the fragile architecture of the winter. Medical examiners worked under the flickering light of a temporary tent, their breath blooming in thick clouds as they inspected the evidence. The signs were hauntingly familiar. There was the telltale bruising around the neck, marks of strong, young hands, and a brutal nature that suggested deep psychological deviancy. Unlike the first case, this was deliberate and quiet. There were no discarded valuables, no signs of a struggle for money. The motive was purely internal. The patterns in the snow showed that the killer had stayed for a long time after the life had left the boy, pacing in small, tight circles around the clearing, perhaps listening to the internal voices that would later define his trial. He was not in a hurry to leave the darkness, appearing at home in the freezing silence. Inside the smoke-filled offices of the militia, the air was thick with tobacco and the heat of iron radiators. Inspector Granid Simakov stared at the photographs of the two victims. The connection was undeniable. Both were young boys, lured with promises of nuts or a view of the trains, and discarded without remorse. The realization settled like a leaden weight. They were dealing with a recurring predator, a ghost without a name. In the 1970s, the concept of a serial killer was seen as a product of the capitalist West. This ideological barrier made the truth difficult for high-ranking officials to accept, complicating the hunt as they struggled to name the monster in their midst. The Soviet system demanded order, and this killer was the definition of chaos, hiding in plain sight among the working class. The initial profile reflected the limited forensic psychology of the era. They looked for someone with access to schools, perhaps a teacher or transit worker. They focused on those whose lives did not conform to Soviet norms. However, Simakov saw something else in the patterns in the snow. He saw the energy of a younger man, someone strong enough to carry a body through deep drifts and haunt the outskirts in sub-zero cold. He began to whisper the word maniac behind closed doors, a term that carried a professional price. The profile they built was a phantom, a man in a simple sports suit, blending into the gray city, waiting for the next snowfall to mask his tracks. They were looking for a person who appeared unremarkable, yet possessed a darkness that defied the socialist ideal of the modern man. As the investigation deepened, Kaibyshev felt the phantom's presence. Parents held their children's hands tighter at bus stops, and playful shouts were replaced by a watchful silence. Every set of footprints in the fresh morning powder was viewed with suspicion, analyzed for the stride of the one they called the boy hunter. The investigators knew the clock was ticking. Once the spring thaw arrived, the evidence in the snow would vanish, washed into the Volga River. For now, the frost held the secrets in a cold grip, and the militia remained in a desperate race to find the man who found pleasure in the shadows. The hunt was no longer just about justice. It was about stopping a cycle that had only just begun to carve its dark name into the Russian ice. The city waited, frozen in fear, as the winter of 1974 continued its long, silent march. The iron veins of the Soviet Union pulse with a rhythm that is both comforting and cold. In the mid-1970s, the Savyalovskaya line was one such artery, a stretch of steel and gravel that carved a path through the northern reaches of the landscape. As the investigation in Kaibyshev continued to grapple with the elusive shadow of Vladimir Usov, the focus shifted toward the geography of the rail lines. Here, the predator found more than just a means of travel. He found a labyrinth. The Savyalovskaya line, with its rhythmic clattering and the pervasive smell of ozone and wet coal, became a character in its own right. It was a place where the boundaries of the city blurred into the dense, dark forests, and where a man could disappear into the steam of a departing locomotive before the echoes of a scream had even fully faded into the night air. To understand the horror of 1974 and 1975, one must understand the isolation of the stations along this particular route. In those years, platforms like Mark and Lyonozovo were not the bustling hubs we might imagine today. They were lonely outposts of concrete and yellow light, often surrounded by nothing but the encroaching birches and the industrial skeletons of half-finished factories. The geography of the tracks created a unique kind of vulnerability. The railway embankments were elevated, looking down upon the dark hollows where the predator waited. For a young soul walking home, the tracks represented a shortcut, a way to navigate the sprawling distance between work and home. But for Vladimir Usov, these tracks were a hunting ground, meticulously mapped out in his mind, where the infrastructure of the state provided the perfect cover for his most private and terrible impulses. He moved through the transit system with the ease of a ghost. The electric trains, known as elektrichkas, arrived and departed with a mechanical precision that masked the irregularities of his movements. He understood the schedules, the exact moments when a platform would be crowded with commuters, and the exact minutes it would fall into a heavy, oppressive silence. This mastery of timing allowed him to blend into the sea of gray overcoats, a face among thousands that no one would remember the next morning. The transit system was his camouflage. He was just another passenger, another tired worker leaning against the cold glass of a window, watching the lights of the city recede. But beneath that mundane exterior, he was calculating the distances between the signal boxes and the unlit paths that led away from the tracks and into the deep, unyielding shadows of the wood line. Imagine the texture of the air on those platforms. It was a mixture of freezing mist and the heavy scent of creosote used to preserve the wooden sleepers. In the winter of 1974, the snow would gather in thick drifts against the steel rails, muffling every sound except for the distant, low hum of the power lines above. The lighting was sparse, provided by a few flickering bulbs that cast long, distorted shadows across the gravel ballast. Every crunch of a boot on that stone was magnified by the stillness. For those who were being watched, the railway was a place of sudden transitions. One moment, they were under the safety of the station lights, and the next, they were descending the stairs into a gray zone where the law seemed to lose its reach. This was the landscape Usov exploited, a world where the very structures built to connect people were used to isolate them in their most desperate moments. The investigators soon realized that the Savyalovskaya line offered the predator something the city streets could not: a multitude of escape routes that bypassed traditional checkpoints. A man could step off a train, commit an unspeakable act in the dark woods bordering the tracks, and be back on a different line heading in the opposite direction before the body was even discovered. The sheer scale of the network was overwhelming. There were hundreds of miles of track, thousands of hiding spots beneath bridges and within maintenance sheds, and an endless stream of anonymous travelers. The geography was a weapon. By choosing victims near the transit lines, he ensured that the search area would be impossibly vast. Each station was a portal, and between them lay a wilderness of industrial decay and natural silence, where the phantom could dissolve into the night, leaving only a chilling sense of dread behind for the police to find. As we look back at the map of the crimes from 1974 to 1975, the pins are clustered like dark stars along the Savyalovskaya line and the surrounding Kaibyshev routes. They tell a story of a predator who understood the modern world better than those hunting him. He used the very symbols of Soviet progress, the trains and the tracks, as the instruments of his terror. The transit system became a ribbon of fear, stretching out into the darkness of the countryside. Parents began to warn their children never to walk the embankments alone, and the once simple act of catching the evening train became a test of courage. The Iron Road was no longer just a path home. It was a reminder that even in the most structured society, there are places where the light does not reach, and where a shadow can wait for a long, long time. The winter of 1974 draped itself over the Savyalovsky railway line like a heavy wool blanket that had seen too many seasons. As the suburban trains, those characteristic green and blue metal shells, rattled toward the edges of Moscow, they carried more than just tired laborers and students. They carried a growing, unspoken weight. If you were to stand on the platform at a station like Dolgoprudnaya or Lobnya during those months, you would notice a change in the air. It was not just the smell of coal smoke and diesel fumes, but a sharp, biting tension. The commuters moved faster now. They no longer lingered by the small kiosks or stood smoking in the dim circles of yellow light provided by the overhead lamps. Instead, they moved in tight clusters, their eyes darting toward the darkness that pressed in from the nearby woods and the industrial zones. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the iron tracks, usually a comforting pulse of Soviet industry, began to sound like a warning. Every screech of the brakes, every hiss of steam from the undercarriage, seemed to mimic the high-pitched anxiety that was beginning to take root in the heart of the community. In the official world of the Soviet Union, there was no such thing as a serial killer. The state newspapers, from Pravda to Izvestia, remained scrubbed clean of such horrors. To the authorities, violent crime of this nature was a rot reserved for the capitalist West, a symptom of a decaying society that could not exist within the socialist dream. Consequently, there were no television warnings, no composite sketches printed on the front pages, and no official curfews. But silence has a way of magnifying fear rather than stifling it. This lack of information created a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped the whispers. The public knew that something was wrong because the absence of news was, in itself, a message. Mothers began meeting their children at the school gates with a new, frantic energy. Door locks that had been left open for decades were suddenly turned, and the heavy iron bolts were slid home long before the sun had even touched the horizon. The people were learning to read the silence of the state, and what they read between the lines was terrifying. It was the railway workers who first began to piece together the fragments of the shadow moving among them. These men and women, the linchpins of the transport system, worked in the dead hours when the rest of the world was tucked away in their concrete apartments. Signalmen in their lonely towers and track maintenance crews with their heavy iron tools began to report strange encounters. One worker, a man who had spent 30 years walking the rails, gave a statement about a figure he saw near a freight depot in late 1974. He described a young man, perhaps no older than 17 or 18, wearing a simple sports suit that seemed far too thin for the biting cold. The stranger didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a ghost, standing perfectly still as a cargo train roared past, the wind from the cars whipping his hair across his face. When the worker called out to him, the figure didn't run. He simply turned and walked into the pitch-black shadows of the timber piles, vanishing as if he had never been there at all. It was these small, chilling observations that began to fill the notebooks of the local militia. The early witness statements gathered by the investigators were often frustratingly vague, yet they all shared a common thread of unease. Commuters spoke of a closeness they felt on the platforms, a sense of being watched from behind the rusted fences or the stacks of building materials. One woman reported a young man following her through the long, echoing pedestrian tunnel at the station. She described the sound of his footsteps, light and rhythmic, echoing precisely 2 seconds after her own. When she stopped, the footsteps stopped. When she ran, the silence behind her felt even heavier. She never saw his face, but she felt his intent. It was a predatory patience that didn't fit the profile of a common thief. These statements weren't being broadcast, but they were being whispered at the bread lines and in the communal kitchens. This was the Seraphim Radio, the underground network of oral history that flourished where the official press failed. Through these whispers, the name of Vladimir Usov began to take on a spectral quality, even before the public knew his name or the true nature of his madness. While the public whispered in the dark, Vladimir Usov was dealing with whispers of his own. The voices that had haunted him since he was a young boy in school had grown louder as 1975 approached. These were not the gentle murmurs of the imagination, but commanding, jagged instructions that left him no peace. To Usov, the railway was not a path to a destination, but a stage where the voices told him he must act. He moved through the crowds like a ghost, his paranoid schizophrenia creating a barrier between him and the world of the living. He saw the witnesses, the workers, and the commuters, but to him, they were merely obstacles or opportunities in a dark play directed by the sounds in his head. The tragedy of this period was the disconnect between the two sets of whispers. If the authorities had listened to the fear on the platforms, and if the medical system had truly understood the depths of Usov's internal storm, perhaps the clustered pins on the map would never have been placed. But in 1974, the two worlds remained separate, joined only by the growing dread that filled the night air along the Savyalovsky line. As the investigation continued in secret, the militia began to realize that they weren't looking for a standard criminal. The witness statements didn't point toward a man with a motive, but toward a presence. The railway workers reported finding strange arrangements of items along the tracks, small piles of stones or discarded clothes that seemed to mark where the shadow had been. The sense of a predator claiming his territory was becoming undeniable. The public unease reached a fever pitch by the spring of 1975. Even without the newspapers, the collective intuition of the city was screaming. Every creak of a train car and every flicker of a station light became a reminder that somewhere in the darkness, someone was watching, waiting, and listening to voices that no one else could hear. The map was filling up, and the shadows were getting longer, reaching out from the railway tracks and into the very homes of those who thought they were safe. The whispers were no longer just sounds. They were the precursors to a nightmare that was only just beginning to reveal its true face. The air in 1974 was heavy with the scent of pine and the cooling dampness of the earth as evening settled over Kybyshev. It was a time when children played until the streetlights flickered to life, and the hum of the city felt like a distant, protective cradle. But in the shadows of the forest massifs that bordered the administrative villages, a different kind of silence was taking hold. Previously, we spoke of how the militia worked in the dark, chasing a phantom that left no traditional signature. They were looking for a criminal who didn't fit the hardened molds of the Soviet underworld. The witness statements were beginning to trickle in, but they were disjointed, like pieces of a mirror shattered on a stone floor. It wasn't until a young woman, returning home along the edge of a wooded park, encountered the figure who would become known as the boy hunter that the investigation finally found its eyes. She was walking alone, the rhythmic click of her heels on the packed dirt path providing a steady pulse to the quiet afternoon. Ahead, she saw him. He didn't look like a monster from a storybook. He looked like a student, or perhaps a young worker on his day off. He was wearing a simple sports suit, the kind of polyester garment common in those years, the fabric making a soft, rhythmic shush-shush sound as he moved. He was standing near a group of trees where the light filtered through the leaves in long, golden needles. As she drew closer, she saw that he wasn't alone. He was speaking to a small boy, leaning down with a posture that seemed, at first glance, helpful. But as she passed, she felt a sudden, inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the encroaching autumn air. She stopped, turning back under the guise of adjusting her coat, and it was then that she saw his face clearly for the first time. In her testimony later, she would dwell on his eyes more than any other feature. She described them as being like glass, not the bright, polished glass of a window, but the dull, unblinking surface of a marble that had been buried in the dirt. There was no anger in him, no heat, no recognizable human emotion. He spoke in a voice that was flat and monotone, a sound that lacked the natural highs and lows of a conversation. It was a mechanical hum, devoid of empathy. He was offering the boy a chance to go into the woods to collect nuts, his hand reaching out in a gesture that felt practiced yet hollow. The survivor, sensing a deep and primal wrongness, didn't keep walking. She stood her ground, her presence a silent interruption. The man in the sports suit turned his vacant gaze toward her, and for a few heartbeats, the world seemed to stop. The silence between them was absolute, a void in the middle of a busy afternoon. Something in her steadfast gaze caused the man to falter. He didn't flee, and he didn't attack. He simply straightened his back and drifted away into the trees, his movements fluid and unsettlingly quiet. The boy, sensing her fear, ran back toward the apartment blocks, but the woman remained haunted by the encounter. When she eventually sat in the dim light of the local militia station, the smell of cheap tobacco and old paper filling the room, she gave the investigators their first real lead. She didn't talk about a hardened criminal. She spoke of a boy-man, barely 17 or 18 years old, whose demeanor suggested someone lost within his own mind. She described the specific pattern of his sports suit, and the way he seemed to listen to things that weren't there, tilting his head as if catching the faint signal of a distant radio station. It was the description of a ghost in a tracksuit, a figure who didn't match the profile of the men they had been following. This testimony was the pivot point for investigator Granid Simakov. Up until this moment, the authorities had been convinced that the culprit was Petr Popov, a physics teacher whose life was being dismantled by the weight of suspicion. But as Simakov listened to the woman describe the attacker's vacant stare and his strangely youthful, detached manner, he realized that the teacher, a man of intellect and complex emotions, could not be the one they were looking for. The survivor's memory provided a contrast that was impossible to ignore. She spoke of a person who acted as though he were under the command of an invisible force, a detail that perfectly aligned with the emerging reality of Vladimir Usov's psychological state. Usov was not motivated by the usual desires of a thief or a killer. He was a boy driven by voices that only he could hear, a prisoner of a fractured reality that manifested in 1974 as a quiet, deadly shadow in a sports suit. The lead was tangible now. The militia shifted their gaze from the schoolrooms and the known delinquents to the psychiatric registers and the quiet neighborhoods where such a boy might hide in plain sight. They looked for someone who moved through the world without a footprint, someone who wore his sports suit like a uniform of invisibility. The woman's memory had cracked the case wide open, even if the city didn't know it yet. She had seen the boy Hunter and survived, leaving behind a description that would eventually lead the investigators to the door of a 19-year-old with the mind of a fractured child and the hands of a predator. The secret investigation was finally beginning to find the light, even as the nights grew longer and the shadows deepened across the parks of Kybyshev. The winter of 1974 had bled into a damp, uncertain spring, and by the time the summer of 1975 arrived, the city of Kybyshev felt as though it were holding its breath. For the investigators of the militia, the air was thick with more than just the humid heat of the Volga River. It was heavy with the weight of a ghost they could not name. They were looking for a presence that left no shadow, a man who seemed to move through the concrete arteries of the city without ever disturbing the dust. In the unofficial whispers of the precinct, he was becoming a myth, an invisible man who preyed upon the very innocents the socialist collective was sworn to protect. The difficulty of the investigation during 1975 lay in its very environment. In this era, the Soviet Union was a place of deep, structured order, where every citizen had a designated space, a role to play, and a record in a sterile filing cabinet. The idea of a predator lurking in the shadows was not just a criminal problem, it was a conceptual one. How could such a person exist in a society built on the common good? This ideological friction made the search slow and agonizing. The detectives found themselves sifting through a sea of gray, looking for a shade that was just slightly darker than the rest. While the official rhetoric often preferred to believe such monsters were a product of distant, capitalist worlds, Vladimir Usov did not look like the nightmare the public imagined. He did not have the wild eyes or the frantic energy of a villain from a paperback novel. Instead, he was a master of the mundane. Having been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia at the age of 14, he existed on the fringes of society as a disability pensioner. To his neighbors and the casual passerby, he was simply another quiet young man, perhaps a bit withdrawn, perhaps a bit eccentric, but ultimately harmless. At 17 years old, he was a child of the system who had learned to navigate its silences. He lived a life of unremarkable routines, cashing his small pension and walking the streets in a simple sports suit that blended perfectly with the thousands of others draped over the shoulders of the working class. It was this very ordinariness that protected him. While the militia searched for outsiders or known criminals with violent records, Usov remained nestled in the heart of the community. He was the invisible man because he was the everyday man. He understood the rhythm of the city. He knew when the workers would be at the factories and when the children would be playing in the courtyards. In August of 1974, he had approached 8-year-old Boris with a suggestion that sounded entirely wholesome in the context of Soviet life. A trip to the forest to collect nuts. It was an activity that spoke of summer, of nature, and of tradition. It was a lure that carried no immediate threat, and so the boy followed him into the deep, deceptive green of the forest massif. The forest itself became a haunting character in this tragedy. In the investigation files, the description of the crime scenes was always a jarring contrast between the beauty of the Russian landscape and the horror left behind. The detectives would spend hours examining the crushed pine needles and the damp earth, searching for a footprint or a shred of fabric that should not be there. The air would be filled with the scent of wild berries and decaying leaves, a sweet, earthy smell that felt at odds with the grim work at hand. In 1975, They did not have the benefit of DNA or complex forensic databases. They had only their eyes, their intuition, and the slow, methodical process of elimination that felt like trying to catch the wind with bare hands. The frustration within the department was palpable. Every time a new lead emerged, it seemed to dissolve into nothingness. They were chasing a phantom who left behind only silence. There were moments when they felt they were close, when a witness would describe a man in a sports suit, but the description was so common that it could have applied to half the young men in the district. The socialist landscape, with its emphasis on uniformity and the collective image, inadvertently provided the perfect camouflage. When everyone is encouraged to look the same, to act the same, the one who is truly different becomes impossible to spot. He was a face in the crowd that no one remembered, a shadow in the midday sun. Usov's internal world, however, was far from mundane. While he walked the streets with a blank expression, his mind was a storm of voices that had haunted him since childhood. He had dropped out of school in the 5th grade because the voices told him to, and now they were whispering darker, more inexorable commands. To the outside world, he was a quiet boy with a disability pension. To himself, he was an agent of a private, terrifying reality. This duality is what made the investigation so difficult. The police were looking for a motive they could understand: revenge, greed, or passion. But Usov's motives were locked away in a mind that the medical science of the 70s was only beginning to map. He was a puzzle where the pieces were made of smoke. As the months of 1975 dragged on, the sense of dread in Kaibyshev grew. The invisible man became a whisper in the queues for bread and a shadow in the eyes of every parent. The militia doubled their patrols, focusing on the parks and the schools, but they were always one step behind. They were looking for a monster, and Usov was merely a ghost in a sports suit, a quiet young man who knew how to disappear into the gray backdrop of the Soviet dream. The case remained a high-stakes game of hide and seek, played in the silence of the city's outskirts, where the only witnesses were the trees and the cold, unyielding earth. The air in Kaibyshev during the late months of 1974 felt different. It was as if the very wind coming off the Volga had grown heavy with the collective anxiety of 1,000 households. The militia, usually a visible and reassuring presence in their crisp uniforms, had begun to undergo a silent transformation. The investigation into the disappearances was no longer a localized concern. It had become an obsession that permeated every level of the regional administration. As the days grew shorter and the frost began to cling to the iron railings of the city thoroughfares, the net began to stretch across the landscape. It was a massive, invisible web being woven by hands that were tired, desperate, and increasingly meticulous. The authorities realized that the traditional methods of policing were not enough to catch a ghost that moved through the city with such terrifying ease. They needed to change their shape, to become as unnoticed and as pervasive as the shadow they were hunting. Undercover operations became the primary order of the day. In the bustling halls of the main railway station, where the steam from the massive locomotives filled the air with a thick, metallic mist, the presence of the law was everywhere and nowhere. Men in unremarkable gray overcoats stood by the newspaper kiosks, their eyes shielded by the brims of flat caps, watching the flow of passengers with a silent, predatory focus. They were trained to look for the outlier, the man who lingered too long near the luggage storage, or the one who watched the children with a gaze that did not match the casual indifference of a traveler. These officers were ghosts in the machine, blending into the queues for tea and the huddles of workers waiting for the early morning commuter lines. They moved through the crowds like shadows, their identities hidden behind the mundane facade of everyday Soviet life, sipping from tin cups and folding newspapers, while their ears remained tuned to every unusual sound. The railway was the central spine of the search. It was the place where the killer seemed to vanish and reappear, using the vast network of tracks as his personal labyrinth. Because of this, the militia turned its gaze inward toward the railway itself. The focus shifted to those who knew the rhythms of the trains, those who had access to the restricted embankments and the quiet, desolate stretches of track that bordered the forest massifs. There was a particular kind of tension in the air at the stations, a rhythmic clatter of wheels on iron that felt like a relentless countdown. The officers patrolling the platforms were tasked with an impossible mission: to find a man who looked like any other citizen in a city of hundreds of thousands. They memorized the layout of every transit hub, every footbridge, and every dimly lit corridor where a person might be lured away from the safety of the lights. The yellowed flicker of the station, lamps cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to jump and dance with every passing engine. Behind the scenes, the administrative effort was equally staggering. In the dim, smoke-filled rooms of the Criminal Investigation Department, thousands upon thousands of personnel records were spread across heavy wooden desks. Each file represented a life: a railway worker, a technician, a switchman, or a conductor. The meticulous cross-referencing was a labor of monumental proportions. Clerks worked through the night, their fountain pens scratching rhythmically against the coarse, thin paper typical of the era. They were looking for patterns, for shifts that aligned with the times of the disappearances, and for men whose personal histories held even the smallest of fractures. The smell of old ink and stale tobacco hung heavy in these rooms as the list of names was narrowed down, one by one, in a grueling process of elimination. It was a war of paperwork, where the weapon of choice was a sharp eye and a tireless commitment to detail. They compared duty rosters with witness statements, trying to place a face in a specific location at a specific hour. The city felt as though it was being watched by 1,000 eyes. In the outskirts, where the urban sprawl gave way to the dense, dark woods, the police presence was even more pronounced. Plainclothes officers walked the paths where children often gathered to play, their pockets heavy with concealed radios and small leather notebooks. Every interaction was scrutinized. Every stranger was a suspect. The atmosphere was one of quiet, vibrating vigilance. Even as the winter of 1974 turned into the thawing ground of 1975, the intensity did not waver. The net was being cast wider and wider, stretching beyond the city limits into the neighboring towns like Tolyatti, reaching into every corner where the shadow of the one they called the boy hunter might be hiding. Parents were warned to keep their children close, but the militia knew that warnings were not enough. They needed to be there, waiting in the brush, standing on the platforms, and watching from the windows of the passing cars. The weight of the case was felt in the silence of the interrogation rooms. The pressure from the central authorities in Moscow was a constant, low-frequency hum in the ears of the lead investigators. There was a desperate need for a result, for a face to put on the posters, and for a sense of closure that could be offered to a terrified public. This pressure created a frantic environment where every lead, no matter how tenuous, was pursued with a feverish intensity. Yet, amidst this chaos, some remained focused on the truth, refusing to be swayed by the easy answers that the hierarchy demanded. They knew that the net had to be strong, but it also had to be precise, lest it catch the innocent while the guilty remained free to roam the iron tracks. The investigation was a machine of immense power, grinding forward through the months, fueled by the hope that one day, the right name would emerge from the mountains of files and the hours of surveillance. The escalation continued through the early months of 1975. The station platforms remained a theater of constant observation, where the steam and the shadows provided cover for both the hunter and the hunted. The rhythmic sound of the telegraph machines, clicking out reports and descriptions, became the heartbeat of the investigation. The list of suspects grew and then shrank, as the meticulous cross-referencing revealed the hollow spots in the stories told by the men who worked the rails. It was a game of patience played out in the coldest hours of the night, in the shadows of the giant water towers and the echoing corridors of the transit hubs. The net was cast across the entire region, and the militia stood in the silence, waiting for the slightest ripple in the water to tell them that the invisible man had finally made his mistake. They knew he was still out there, moving through the fog, unaware that the world was slowly closing in around him, one record and one shadow at a time. The air in Kybyshev during the month of June, 1975, was thick with midsummer heat. It carried a weight of unspoken dread that had been building since the previous August. The city, usually a hum of Soviet industrial progress, had begun to turn inward. Parents kept their children closer to the courtyards, their eyes scanning the edges of the shadows. The forest massifs that surrounded the administrative villages, once places of weekend escape and berry picking, had become terrains of uncertainty. As the sun beat down on the dusty streets, the investigation into a series of disappearances remained stagnant, a collection of files with too many questions and not enough names. But in the quiet bureaucracy of the archives, the threads of a single life were beginning to intersect. On the 17th of June, the heat peaked, baking the pine needles on the floor of the forest near the village of Gorly Kuter. It was here that the escalation reached its final, most desperate point. A small fire began to crawl through a heap of dry brushwood, the smoke rising in a thin, lazy column toward the canopy. It was a crude attempt at concealment, a frantic gesture of a mind losing its grip on the logic it had previously maintained. The fire was not large enough to consume the evidence, but the smell of the burning wood acted as a beacon. When the authorities arrived, they found a scene that mirrored the tragedies of the previous year. But unlike the first murder in 1974, this time the predator had left a trail that was still warm. The true turning point, however, occurred not in the forest, but in the hesitation that followed. Just a day after the fire, the man who would be known as the boy hunter attempted to claim 2 more victims. He approached 2 young boys, his shadow falling long across the grass. But something in the atmosphere had shifted. The voices he claimed to hear, those internal commands that had driven him since he was 14 years old, seemed to falter. For the first time, fear took up residence in the space where compulsion had lived. He moved toward them, then stopped. He led them toward the trees, then wavered. In that stutter of intent, the 2 children saw a chance. They did not wait for the predator to decide their fate. They ran. They fled back toward the safety of the village. When the boys were brought before the investigators, they spoke of a man in a blue sports suit, a common enough sight in the Soviet Union, yet they described his movements as disjointed and his gaze as vacant. They spoke of a man who seemed to be listening to a conversation they could not hear. This detail was the spark that ignited the search. The investigators realized they were not looking for a seasoned criminal or a calculating mastermind. They were looking for someone whose reality was fractured. They began to focus on a specific physical identification: the blue tracksuit, the youthful face that belied a dark maturity, and the peculiar, erratic gait. This was the physical link that narrowed the search from a city of hundreds of thousands down to a specific subset of the population. The forensic link was not found in a laboratory, but in the overlap of state records. The Kybyshev authorities turned their attention to the registries of the local psychiatric clinics and the lists of those receiving state pensions for mental disabilities. They were looking for a young man, likely in his late teens, who lived within the Kirovsky or Krasnoglinsky districts and who fit the description of the man in the sports suit. They began to cross-reference the dates of the disappearances with the medical checkups of patients in the area. In the center of this Venn diagram sat a single name: Vladimir Alexandrovich Usov. He was 18 years old, a former student who had dropped out because the voices in his head told him the school was no longer safe. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when the police compared the locations of the crimes to Usov's known wandering patterns. He was a man of the periphery, always moving along the edges of the forest massifs he knew so well. When they moved in to make the arrest, they found a young man who seemed almost relieved that the chase was over. The sports suit was found, as were the memories of the voices that had commanded him to act. The forensic link was solidified not by a fingerprint, but by the tragic consistency of his own illness and the records the state had kept on him since he was a child. The search that had claimed the lives of 5 young boys ended with the quiet closing of a file. Predictable, yet lethal habits. The final days of the hunt converged on a single, desolate location in the Kybyshev region. It was the middle of 1975, and the air was heavy with the expectation of a storm. The police had positioned themselves at a remote railway platform, a place where the tracks bisected the industrial outskirts and the wild, unlit woods. They knew that Usov, driven by impulses he could barely contain, would return to the transit lines that had served as his hunting grounds. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the station transformed into a skeleton of steel and concrete, a lonely outpost where the only sound was the wind whistling through the overhead wires. The officers waited in the deep shadows of the freight terminal, their eyes straining against the gathering dark. The platform was lit by a few flickering bulbs that cast a sickly, yellowish glow over the scene. The smell of creosote and old oil rose from the wooden sleepers, a scent that would forever be associated with the tension of that night. Hidden among the crates of machinery, the investigators remained motionless for hours. Every rustle of a dry leaf or the distant bark of a dog sent a jolt of adrenaline through their veins. They were men who had seen the worst of humanity, but the case of the boy hunter had left a particular scar on their collective psyche. They were not just looking for a criminal. They were trying to stop a ghost that had been snatching children from the very heart of their community. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the station clock. Around midnight, the distant hum of the tracks began to vibrate through the station floor. It was the late train, a lumbering beast of iron and steam that signaled the start of the final act. As the engine rounded the bend, its headlight cut a broad, white path through the mist, illuminating the empty benches and the cold gravel. The train pulled into the station with a screech of brakes and a hiss of escaping steam, momentarily filling the air with a thick, white shroud. A few weary passengers stepped onto the platform, their collars turned up against the chill. Among them, a figure detached itself from the shadows near the back of the carriages. He was young, barely 18 years old, wearing a nondescript jacket. He didn't look like a threat. He looked like any other traveler lost in the night. But as the train departed and the steam began to clear, the young man's behavior changed. He didn't head for the exit. Instead, he lingered at the edge of the platform, his eyes scanning the surrounding darkness with a predatory intensity. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, his footsteps barely making a sound on the concrete. The officers watched him from their concealment, their hearts hammering against their ribs. This was the moment they had prepared for through months of surveillance and discovery. They watched as he reached into his pocket, his gaze fixed on a lone figure who had stayed behind. The air seemed to freeze as the gap between the hunter and his next potential victim began to close. The signal to move was a sharp, short whistle from the lead investigator. Suddenly, the stillness was shattered. The officers surged from their hiding places, their heavy boots thundering against the ground. The young man, startled by the sudden intrusion of light and sound, spun around, his face a mask of shock. He made a desperate attempt to leap from the platform onto the tracks, hoping to lose himself in the maze of shadows beneath the parked coal wagons. But the investigators were upon him before he could find his footing. There was a brief, violent struggle as they wrestled him to the ground, the sound of his ragged breathing mixing with the commands of the militia. The metallic click of the handcuffs signaled the end of his reign of terror. He didn't fight for long. Instead, he slumped into the dirt, his eyes wide and vacant, as if the voices that drove him had finally gone silent. As they pulled him to his feet, the officers found the evidence they needed in his discarded bag. The immediate aftermath was a blur of activity, with flashlights cutting through the dark and the arrival of more patrol cars. Yet, amidst the noise, there was a profound sense of relief that the boy hunter would never strike again. As they led Vladimir Usov away from the tracks and into the cold light of the station office, the weight of the case began to settle. The platform returned to its usual, lonely silence, but the shadows were no longer quite as long. The night was ending, and for the first time in a year, the city could finally begin to breathe. The arrest was complete, but the journey into his mind was only just beginning. The immediate aftermath was a blur of activity, with Usov being ushered into the back of a dark sedan, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. As the car sped away from the village of Gorly Kuter, the silence inside the vehicle was heavy, broken only by the low hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of a police radio. Vladimir sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the passing shadows of the Soviet night. He did not struggle. He did not protest his innocence. There was a peculiar, unsettling calm about him that made the officers exchange wary glances. Soon, the car pulled up to the imposing gates of the Regional Detention Center, a place where the air seemed to thicken with the weight of secrets and the scent of damp concrete. The heavy iron door of the interrogation wing swung open with a slow, agonizing groan, echoing through the empty corridor like a warning. Inside, the walls were painted a dull, sickly green, peeling in the corners to reveal the gray stone beneath. This was where the mask would finally be stripped away, in a room lit by a single, flickering bulb that cast long, distorted shadows against the floor. The interrogation room was small and suffocatingly quiet. Vladimir was seated on a wooden chair bolted to the floor, his hands resting on a table scarred by years of tension and desperate cigarette burns. Across from him sat the investigators, their faces hardened by what they had already seen at the crime scenes. They looked at the young man before them, barely 18 years old, with a slight build and features that could almost be described as boyish. It was difficult to reconcile this unassuming figure with the predator who had haunted the forests and courtyards since 1974. For several minutes, no one spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall and the distant, muffled sound of a door slamming elsewhere in the facility. Usov did not look away. His eyes were dark pools of indifference, lacking the flicker of fear or the spark of defiance one would expect from a captured man. When the first question was finally asked, his voice was a flat, clinical monotone, devoid of any emotional resonance. It was as if he were discussing a stranger's life rather than his own dark journey into the abyss. He began to speak of the voices. With a chilling matter-of-factness, Vladimir described the auditory hallucinations that had plagued him since he was a mere child of 14. He spoke of how the voices had first told him to stop attending school, leading to a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia and a small pension from the state. But as 1974 approached, the commands grew more insistent, more violent. He described the internal dialogue not as a descent into madness, but as a series of instructions that he felt compelled to follow with the precision of a soldier. The investigators watched him closely, searching for a sign of a break, a tremor in his hand, or a tear in his eye, but there was nothing. He spoke of the first victim, young Boris, whom he had encountered in August of 1974. He recounted the lure of collecting nuts in the forest, a simple and innocent suggestion that masked a terrifying intent. He remembered the weather that day, the texture of the leaves underfoot, and the way the light filtered through the trees, all with a photographic memory that made the hairs on the back of the investigators' necks stand on end. As the hours stretched into the early morning, the depth of his lack of remorse became terrifyingly clear. Usov detailed each of his 4 victims with a detached, forensic accuracy. He described the act of strangulation and the subsequent violations as if they were mechanical processes, tasks to be completed and then discarded. There was no sense of the human cost, no recognition of the families destroyed or the lives cut short. When asked why he had set fire to the body of his final victim in June of 1975, he simply shrugged, stating that it was a way to conclude the event. His psychological profile, as it began to emerge in that dimly lit room, was a labyrinth of contradictions. He was a man who had functioned within society, a son who had lived under his parents' roof, yet he existed in a state of profound emotional isolation. The investigators realized they were not dealing with a man driven by sudden rage or uncontrollable passion, but something far more organized and hollow. He was a vessel for a darkness he didn't even care to understand. The most haunting aspect of the confession was Usov's total absence of a moral compass. He did not seek forgiveness, nor did he offer any excuses beyond the voices in his head. At one point, he even expressed a sense of relief that the investigation into the physics teacher, Petr Popov, had been corrected. Not out of a sense of justice for the innocent man who had nearly been executed, but because it meant the record of his own work was now accurately attributed to him. He took a perverse pride in the specificity of his crimes, correcting the investigators on minor details of the locations or the methods he used. The psychological evaluation that followed would confirm the diagnosis of schizophrenia, but the doctors would struggle to explain the sheer coldness of his character. He was a boy who had grown up in a house filled with the smell of alcohol and the sound of shouting, yet he had turned that chaos into a silent, methodical campaign of terror. As the session finally drew to a close, the investigators felt a profound sense of exhaustion, as if the very air in the room had been drained of its vitality by the presence of the man across the table. When the guards returned to lead him back to his cell, Vladimir Usov stood up slowly, smoothed his clothes, and walked toward the exit without a single backward glance. The iron door of the interrogation room shut behind him with a final, heavy thud, sealing the confessions within those cold stone walls. The documents were gathered, the recordings were labeled, and the machinery of the Soviet legal system began to turn toward the eventual trial. But for those who had sat across from him, the memory of his unblinking eyes and his steady, monotone voice would linger long after the case was officially closed. They had looked behind the iron door of his mind and found a place where empathy did not exist, where the only reality was the command of the voices and the cold logic of the predator. The investigation was over, the evidence was overwhelming, and the boy who hunted in the shadows was finally contained. In the silence of the detention center, the weight of the truth settled over the facility, a dark testament to the year 1975 and the secrets that had finally been dragged into the light of day. The courtroom in late 1975 was a place of heavy shadows and stifled breaths. As the year turned its cold shoulder toward the coming winter, the city of Kaibyshev seemed to hold its breath. Inside the walls of the regional court, the air was thick with the scent of old floor wax and the faint, metallic tang of the radiators. Vladimir Usov sat behind the wooden railing, a figure who seemed almost too ordinary for the darkness he carried. He was only 18 years old, but the weight of his actions in 1974 and 1975 had aged the community by decades. The light through the high windows was pale and gray, casting long silhouettes across the faces of the judges. Every rustle of paper felt like a thunderclap in the oppressive, cold and winter silence. The evidence presented was a harrowing map of a short but devastating span of time. The prosecution spoke of 4 young boys whose lives had been extinguished in the forests and quiet corners of the region. They spoke of Boris, who had been only 8 years old on that warm August day in 1974. The details were visceral, the suggestion of gathering nuts in the forest, the sports suit Usov wore, and the tragic discovery in the brushwood. The court listened to the texture of the coroner's reports, describing the violent end of innocence. Each victim's name was a soft chime in the stillness: Boris, Valery, and the others whose laughter had been replaced by a chilling silence. The prosecution laid out the charred remains of brushwood and the signs of a struggle that had haunted the dreams of many parents in the Soviet state. Perhaps the most haunting shadow in the room was the ghost of a trial that almost was not. For a long time, the authorities believed they had their man in Petr Popov. Petr, a physics teacher, had nearly been crushed by the weight of a false confession. The court recalled how he had sat in a cell, writing a final letter, ready to surrender his life to a crime he did not commit. The injustice had been a palpable thing, a heavy mist that threatened to swallow the truth. It was only through the persistent, quiet work of Inspector Granid Simakov that the path began to clear. Simakov had looked past the easy answers, finding the real signs of the boy hunter. The tension of that investigation, the risk Simakov took with his own career, hung in the courtroom like the smoke of a distant fire. As the proceedings moved toward their conclusion in the final months of 1975, the focus shifted to the mind that conceived these acts. Vladimir Usov did not speak with the defiance of a rebel, but with the flat, unsettling detachment of a man listening to a broadcast only he could hear. The medical experts took the stand, their voices low and clinical. They spoke of paranoid schizophrenia and the voices that Usov claimed had commanded him since his early teens. These voices, he said, had whispered to him in the 5th grade, telling him to leave school and the forest. The diagnosis of insanity was not a reprieve, but a different kind of sentence. It was a recognition that the monster in the woods was a product of a shattered psyche, a vessel for a darkness he could not manage. The resolution of the case brought a somber finality. While the formal ruling for compulsory treatment would be etched into the records, the late months of 1975 marked the moment the terror truly ended. Usov was to be sent away, far from the courtyards and forests of Kaibyshev. His destination was the specialized psychiatric clinics, first in Kazan and later in Samara, where the walls were high and the days were measured in decades. For the next 30 years, he would remain a ghost in the system, a name lost to the deep archives. The families of the 4 boys stood in the cold air outside the courthouse, watching the gray sky. There was no joy in the verdict, only the heavy relief that the shadow had finally been pinned down. As we reflect on those years, 1974 and 1975, we see a world that has long since faded. The city of Kaibyshev has returned to its name of Samara, and the forests where the boy hunter once roamed have grown tall over the scars of the past. Vladimir Usov passed away in 2006, taking the final remnants of his voices into the earth. The legacy of Inspector Simakov remains a testament to the power of a single person seeking the truth. Tonight, we leave the cold stone of the courthouse behind. The streets are quiet now, and the windows of the city are very dark and still in the night air. Sleep now and let the world drift away. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.